Hello, students. This is Dr. Winkler again. Wherever you're at, whatever you're doing, I hope you're having the best day ever. Like we said in the Navy, it's a fine Navy day. Well, right now I'm going to say this is a fine history day. This lecture would be the second lecture I would have given on the week of the 13th through the 16th. So that's about where we're at as far as the class is concerned. I don't know about you, but I'm having a good time. Anytime I can sit in my duff, talk about history, I'm doing quite well, actually. Well, as you know, we're into the Middle Ages. Last time, I'm sure you recall that we were talking about various aspects of the Middle Ages, including the Vikings. Vikings, of course, had a big impact on what was going on. Well, after the Vikings are gone, after there's no more Vikings, we do have feudalism coming in, and a lot of things start happening, particularly after the year 1000, when the Vikings and the Saracens, the Magyars are pushed out, and now Europe can become involved in its own resources, and it can develop its own culture. This culture is, shall we say, an amalgam between what's left over from Rome. It's also introducing new elements, which we get from other peoples like the Germanic tribes and a development of local peoples in places like Britain and France. Well, this is to me one of the most exciting eras of human history. So many fun things are going on. As you know from looking through our study guide, quite frankly, I got carried away. I've got all kinds of topics here. All they're fun. Expansive learning, medieval literature. My goodness. I already had a lecture on early medieval technology. Well, then we get high medieval technology where it really gets good. And of course, we have many other areas, saints' lives, how the church promotes morality in society. I even have the Crusades. Crusades, of course, extremely interesting and important as we look in the modern world, particularly when the Muslims are accusing Christians of being so brutal because of the Crusades, and in essence ignoring what they were doing as well. But I can spend a lot of time with this, but I would like to look at things that excite me the most, though everything here is exciting. One of the things that excites me very, very much, and I'm down here, what page are we on, 17? We are on page 17 if you like to follow along. So I'm jumping over a few things. I might come back to them. The bottom, shall we say, page 17. Let's talk a little bit about the freeing of society. This gets really good. I enjoy this very much. Well, what is it like in Europe before you have a free society? We talked about slavery in ancient Rome. That makes a big difference. But not everybody's enslaved, though a very large percentage of the people are slaves. Well, what is it like by the time you get to the High Middle Ages? What is society like? Who's ruling? Well, depending on what you want to call these important people, there are kings. A king, of course, controls an entire nation. The King of France, the King of England. We have princes, sometimes prince. I know by one definition, a prince is somebody who is a child, a son of a king. Well, it also means that there are people that have a little slightly lesser status as far as the noble hierarchy is concerned. Nobles can be anything, literally beneath kings and princes. They can be margraves, they can be counts, they can be a lot of different levels of society. Can we say virtually everywhere? Everywhere in Europe, almost. You actually have these people, these noble factions ruling. Well, then we have something else. This is exciting to me. we get the lower classes become free. I'm going to say this is one of the great social developments in human history. I'm going to say that this leads to more technology, more education. I'm going to say that this is a key factor in having a life where people can be more in control of what they're doing rather than being controlled by somebody else. And that's extremely valuable. I have right here, as you can see, we see the reinvention of democracy. Really? I would like to do more research on this and maybe write more on this, write something like medieval democracy. Some people say, medieval democracy? Isn't that a contradiction in terms? It would be for much of the Middle Ages, but late in the Middle Ages, we see some institutions coming out which are, in fact, democracies, and it's in the Middle Ages. Going back up to our point of discussion right here, we have the first representative governments in a millennium. Don't have representative governments outside of Europe. And last time you had a representative government was during Rome. Let me repeat what I told you about the Roman Senate. By our standards, it leaves a lot to be desired. The Roman Senate is not, it can be voted on. Remember, the Romans do vote. This is after the democracies, particularly in Athens, had winked out in Greece. But the Senate continues to exist. You cannot just have anybody. You can't have a shopkeeper, for example, running for the Senate. So it has to be people of a higher caste is the wrong word, a higher level of society. And these people, and not everybody can vote, so it is inadequate to a certain extent. But he does have real power until the empire comes forward. Remember when you have Caesar Augustus, he comes out and he says, oh, by the way, I will allow the Senate to exist, but he really gives them no power. We read about it still in existence in the 5th century, in the century in which the political structure of Rome winks out. But they still don't have any power. Okay. We can say that there's a representative government involved here, but quite frankly, it's weak and doesn't really fit our matrix, our definition. Then something happens. We have this city council and first representative governments in a millennium. I will come back and discuss that. And we find that the city councils are dominated by guild masters. Okay, our best example of this is, of course, the cities in Germany, the German Empire. There are other examples in other places as well. But usually the city council is chosen it's nominated by guild masters. A guild, as you know, is a workers' organization. Some people want to look at them and say they're similar to trade unions. There's enough dissimilarities. I'm going to say that is probably not the best comparison. Any event, what guilds are societies or organizations. They're organizations within a certain industry. And this can be blacksmiths, it can be fishmongers, it can be weavers, it can be tanners, it can be carpenters, it can be a lot of people. Now, notice those are some of your basic working groups in any city. And as you develop these things, you start out with lower level and you come in, they teach you how to do various things. And eventually you become very, very good within your guild. And but you want somebody to be the master of the guild for several reasons. You want somebody to help make decisions, at least be a person which you can use to throw out ideas, to keep the quality of your product high. You want to make sure you have a good, high quality product because it'll sell better. And you also want somebody to represent you on the city council. How do you choose these people? was going to say men. Not all the guilds are male guilds, but the vast majority are. Nonetheless, you choose them by, let's raise our hands, popular vote. That's a pure democracy. The masters, the important people in the guilds, vote. And then these guild masters, who've been representing their guilds, will in fact be able to go into the city council. It takes a while. We'll get into more detail later on. It takes a while. There's a lengthy development in which you get a few guild masters in the city councils, and later on you get more and more until the guilds are dominating the city council. In other words, you have people that are voted going in and now controlling the city government. This is a functioning republic or democracy, if you will. So these men are chosen by vote, and this is pure democracy. Yes, women are out of this. Okay, this is not a pure democracy as you and I would love to have it, but it's a great advance. Well, the guild revolutions in Germany, largely in the 13th, these are the 1200s to the 14th century, the 1300s, where you actually have an explosion of cities, and there are hundreds of municipalities, towns, cities in Germany that actually choose this form of government, where you actually have a economic matrix that includes guilds. I should give you an idea of how many guilds there were. In the city of Zurich, for example, there were 12 guilds that were represented in city government. In Paris, this is a little hard to believe. I need to do more research on this. But I have read that in Paris there were as many as 100 guilds that were functioning. Of course, Paris is one of the biggest cities in Europe. It probably is the biggest city. And its number of people was probably in the hundreds of thousands. If this being the case, of course, you could see how influential the guilds might be. Now, as we look upon the freeing of society, you say, well, how are people in cities free if most people are in fact serfs at this time? We'll come back to that in just 1 minute. Well, one of the ways you take a look at this is that if by law, this is German cities, if you can come in and survive in this city for 366 days, that's 1 year and 1 day, you become free. Well, what does that mean? It means that you're not just somebody who ran off the farm and ran in and you hid out for a while. No, you have to be economically viable. There has to be a means by which you have the ability to survive in the city. This is the 1 year and 1 day. This shows that you have been there long enough, that you are part of the economic system, therefore you can survive. And you might bring a skill with you. You might be a blacksmith, for example. And these people can function. And there's a good old German saying, I like it very much, Stadtluft macht frei, city air makes you free. Now, by our standards, the cities in Germany at this time frame are not exactly clean places. Garbage removal is like you dump it out on the street. Very fortunately, there's a lot of rain in Germany. They have a lot of thunderstorms. And usually cities are on a slope. Very often they're near a river. And obviously the banks of the river slope into the river. So when it rains or thunderstorm, and you'll wash all this material down into the river. Of course, the rivers aren't very clean because of this. Nonetheless, the area doesn't smell good. You could imagine how much garbage and human waste there might be on the streets at any given time. And however, so it doesn't smell good, but it is quite nice because if you're in there, despite the smell, it's a great place to be because you're free. Therefore, the German cities also become something of a refuge. Yeah, they just don't open their doors for anybody running in because you have to be able to survive economically. On the other hand, if you do have the skills and you want to get out of another situation, and you want to advance yourself, you go into a city. So, to a certain extent, they are places of refuge. What is it like? Get over here. Most common form of human control or human labor in the Roman Empire. Well, we can say it's slavery. Now, as much as I have disparaged slavery, and I don't like slavery for a number of reasons, in reality, slavery never does completely disappear. Throughout the entire Middle Ages, there are still people that are slaves. I'm sure you're aware that the Slavic peoples that came after the Germanic invasions come into Central and Western Europe, Southern Europe as well. We also have another group of people coming in called the Slavs. And the term Slav actually probably came from slave, because these people came in later. They could be, shall we say, often captured, often taken and enslaved. Even in the height of the Renaissance, in some of these brilliant Renaissance cities, including Florence, Milan, Venice, and even Rome, there are still a few slaves that continue to be within the system. This does not mean, however, that this is a severe form of slavery, but it does mean slaves do exist. I'm going to argue that this is not as common. Slavery becomes a very minor institution in the Middle Ages and on into the Renaissance. What are we seeing socially for very large numbers of people going from the ancient time frame through the Middle Ages to the late Middle Ages? And I have up here, let's see if I can get it for your viewing pleasure, slavery to serfdom to freedom. I mentioned a little bit last time about how you end up with serfdom. A serf is somebody who is largely there for protection. Remember, I talked about the feudal system. I talked about the manorial system, where you have a warrior class that lives in the castle quite often, and the peasants who support them by food. And so you give food, taxes, to the warrior class, the nobles, and in return they protect you. And so the condition we usually associate with manorialism is serfdom. A serf is not a slave, but the condition of the serf is not very good. A serf can actually be tied to the land. In other words, the serf cannot leave the land. If the serf is interested in going someplace else, trying it someplace else, by law, this person should stay. Of course, going back to the city year makes you free. Sometimes you can get away if you would like and survive in the city. A serf has some rights. Remember, slaves have very few, if any, rights. A serf has some rights. However, in the Middle Ages, we do see the condition of freedom is the most desirable. It's hard to get a real good feeling as to what the serfs, the unfree people, were actually feeling. They can't write. And if they could write, very little of that kind of thing has survived. However, from the sources, we do get a few accounts, which I've run across, where people are actually talking to a serf. And I remember in one of these sources, a man's talking to a serf. The serf says, "Oh, if I were only free. Oh, I would have these less burdens. I have more choices in my life." It's a very desirable condition. Serfs are often tried in manorial courts. If there's a disagreement, shall we say, between the serf and the lord, and it's in the manorial court, which the lord dominates, well, who's going to win? The decision will be made in favor of the nobles. And the serfs have to pay special taxes. I will come back to that later on in just a minute. As a matter of fact, they have feudal dues. You got to pay a certain amount of money. You're supposed to give money to the church. There's a lot of things that burden these people. Let's define freedom a little bit. Why is this so desirable? You and I think freedom in very, very broad terms. Freedom means we can have all kinds of level of choices. This is part of their concept of freedom as well. However, we can almost interpret this as meaning privilege. It's not just being free to do anything. It's free to do certain things that is very, very, shall we say, desirable. Okay, privilege. Among these privileges, which the serfs would like to have when they achieve freedom, is actually freedom to marry. Whoa! You and I say, goodness, I'll marry anybody. I can talk into it. Our society says, my goodness, you're restricting people. Yes, you are. I'm not saying this is commonly done. I'm going to very obviously say that this is rarely done. But when it is done, it can be very, very irksome. There are instances which we have in which the landlord says, you know, we're not having enough kids. I need a workforce coming up next generation, and literally force people to marry. And sometimes they're forced to marry people they don't like. You can imagine how very, very irksome that would be. I mean, you and I have a very strong idea of this romantic love, and it is so good. Oh, you lucky young people. You know, you're out there and you get to, I mean, I remember first time holding hands with a girl. My goodness, whew, man, I was on top of the clouds. Romantic love, we love it. A lot of times marriage in the Middle Ages was actually an economic relationship. I'm not saying there wasn't holding hands involved, and I'm not saying there wasn't a lot of fun, but I am going to say that a lot of times actually the marriage vow placed you together and you would survive better economically. We know more about this when we talk about the noble classes. In fact, a lot of times marriage within the highest levels, the kings, the princes, the nobles, were economic and political arrangements. For example, we have the kings of France marrying their kids to the, shall we say, daughters of the noble or the royal family in France, which becomes extremely interesting by the time we get to the 14th century. Because there's a problem with the royal family in France. In other words, essentially the king's line dies out. And perhaps the person with the best claim to the throne of France is actually a, okay, what's going on here? Is actually the King of England. That ends up being a big problem because we fight a war over it called the 100 Years' War, which lasts more than 100 years, 1337 to 1353. And that's going to devastate France, primarily. Well, that's the kind of thing that can happen. On the local level, you're probably better off, are you not, economically, if you have a nice wife and she cooks and she tends the garden near your hut while the husband is out doing harder, heavier manual labor. I'm not going to say it's harder. Heavier manual labor like plowing. So these can be arrangements that help economically. Bury, you right to bury? What? Well, sometimes you have to have permission to bury. Let me give you an example. There was a, in what you now call Eastern Switzerland, it's about 1410, there was a peasant who was buried, and the family put him in the ground. And the noble came by and said, wait a minute, okay, you haven't paid the proper feudal dues, and I think you buried too much wealth with that man. So they dug him up and removed his clothing. Now, we wouldn't do that because clothing for us is pretty cheap, because we have manufactured clothing. I even have a change of shirts. I mean, these kind of things which we have. Back then, an extra pair of trousers would be certainly a luxury because they are made out of wool. It is hard to weave the wool. They are very durable. They're very warm. It's a very, very good means of making clothing. But if it takes a long time to make these things, you can imagine how expensive they would be. And the noble didn't want the corpse to be buried with something that he could use, he could sell later. There was a major revolt. The Swiss peasants rose up. We have battles that are being fought over this. But this is just an example of the kind of power that these people have. You have to have privilege, you have to have permission to go across a bridge. If you don't have permission, if you don't have this privilege, you have to pay for it. Sometimes when you're grinding the mill. You have to have permission for that too. You have to pay a fee for that. If you are free, if you have this privilege, maybe you can grind your grain in the mill without special permission or without paying special fees. So freedom is very desirable. Well, how do people get free? There is a number of factors, several actually, in which we see the peasants the serfs getting the ability to become free. One of these is inflation. I'm old enough, in fact, I was not very young when this was going on. We call this the Carter inflation of the 1970s. There were years when President Carter was president of the United States where we actually had, if my memory serves correctly, inflation is like 22% a year. You see that happening. It got to be kind of embarrassing. Okay, I went down to the grocery store. I bought some groceries. I bought some milk. Well, a week later, I went back to find out that the price of milk's gone up, literally within 1 week. And this went on for, in many cases, many weeks or months. But something that's slow, that inflation that takes decades, generations, or even centuries, is very much harder to detect. What happens is this. According to feudal law, according to feudal custom, the peasants pay a certain amount of money, some coins, a year to the noble. And earlier on, this could have been somewhat burdensome. Later on, with inflation, and inflation was probably so low that you probably would take generations before it had even gone over 50%. But over generations, maybe a century or two, the coins you're actually giving to the noble mean a lot less than they did in earlier times. So therefore, the burden on the serf that's making these payments is less, and the amount of buying power that's coming to the nobles becomes less as well. Well, what can he do? Well, he can go back, the noble can go back to the feudal courts. Sometimes you want to forge a document where you change the numbers. Sometimes you can actually go forward and go into the courts and make a court case against these people. And of course, the nobles do have power of coercion. Remember, the knights are kind of hired guns. They can push people around, that kind of thing. I'm not going to say that he doesn't have resources, but I am going to say that overall, the peasants, the serfs, are getting more and more influence because they are needed. The noble wants more money. He's got to maintain that castle. Very expensive. He's got to maintain his lifestyle. These spices, if he can get them, they're terribly expensive. The armed retinue, all this is very expensive, and he doesn't want to cut back on his lifestyle. So you go to the peasants, and he goes to the peasants and say, well, look, I need more money. And the peasants say, sure, but we want something in return. He says, what? He says, more freedom. In other words, go back to these ideas of privilege. And sometimes, over time, the peasants are able to negotiate more freedoms. They're able to negotiate more privileges. And over time, the peasants buy these freedoms. Okay, so this becomes a factor. Okay, let me go back up here and address a slightly different issue, which is related to this. It gets so bad for many of the nobles that what do you do if you can't get enough money to support your lifestyle? Well, you can get loans. And what do you put up for collateral? Well, you put up your horses, you put up your army, you put up your land, you can put up your castle. It is surprising to me in reading the sources from late medieval Germany. It's almost to the point that Germany's for sale. So many of these castles have been mortgaged that if you got enough money to buy out the guy who owns these things, you can come in and you can actually get a castle and get the land that goes with it. It gets that challenging for the nobles, and the peasants benefit. Let's go back down here on page 18, as you can see. And now there's a population decline. I had you read that article about the introduction of the Black Death into Switzerland and how the Swiss decided to react, and that's by killing Jews. Now remember, that is the thrust of the article, and I hope that you gain something out of it. However, I didn't speak in broad terms, and broad terms includes population decline. After 1300, we see a challenging scenario. If you have time later in this class, I will come back and address these issues more carefully. The population decline is brought on by the Black Death, probably the biggest single factor. But there are other factors as well, and one of the factors, of course, would include bad weather, bad harvests, fewer people. Okay, so we have diseases and we have weather. And we find that the population goes down, in some cases quite dramatically. It can go very far down. Well, when you have demand is still high, but your resources are low. In other words, you still have a lot of land, but you don't have peasants enough to till that soil. I know serfs technically aren't supposed to be able to slip out and go to other places. In reality, they get around this. They can sneak away if they want to. And in reality, what we find now is that peasants can say, oh, by the way, you don't give me what I want here. I'll go to the next manor over there, and they'll give me what I want. You can bid. You can actually have a bidding war. You can negotiate rights. So this is another factor in freedom of society. By the time, let's go back up here for just 1 second. By the time you actually get to the late Middle Ages, that the most common nature, most common social strata, if you will, of the lower classes is one of freedom. That's true in Germany, that's true in England, that's true in Switzerland, that's true in other places as well. Okay, let's go back down here. We're talking about some factors. Okay, population decline. We're talking about inflation. We're also talking about the right to bear arms. The right to bear arms. Can we say, if you were to walk into a community, and there are a lot of villages, this is true in a lot of places, where some of the people are still serfs. Hopefully they're going to be able to improve their situation. But also in the same community, there are people that are free. The most obvious difference, at least to look around the community, would be the right to bear arms is the difference between the free and unfree. If you have a weapon, it might be a long spear, we call them pikes. It might be a battle axe. Later on, it can be a crossbow, it can be a musket. If you see somebody that is carrying a weapon, that is a sure sign that they are free. As you could well imagine, this is much coveted. Now, let's take a look here, and I'm going to come back down and talk about the development of people being able to protect themselves. So I'm not leaving this, but I'm going to talk about something else slightly different, and I will come back to the idea of your ability not only to bear arms, but your ability to provide for your own defense. Free peasant communities. Years ago, when I was talking to a graduate student, long time ago, and he said, what'd you do your dissertation on? I says, well, Swiss communities, free societies. He says, well, how did this develop? Well, we don't have the kinds of records that would actually sit down in the high Middle Ages and say, oh, this is what happens in these communities. Later on, we do have records, but we do believe in Switzerland, in Swiss communities. By the 13th century, this is by the 1200s, that we see free communities. We see them in Glarus, we see them in Schwyz, We see them in Uri, various places, largely up in the Alps. But they are free peasant communities that's been around now for a very lengthy period of time. A commune is something else that develops. It develops in Holland, it develops in Spain, no, I shouldn't say Spain. It develops in Italy, it develops in Germany. Communes. Government by citizens. I introduced this already when talking about the guildmasters. The guildmasters come in, you have these votes. Well, what you have happening is this. Within communities, we have various factions that tend to control the community's government. If there is a monastery, a lot of times communities actually go up around monasteries. The head people in the monasteries will have a very big influence in what's going on in the city councils. Nobles are there. Nobles own the castles nearby. They have economic interests. So a lot of times the nobles are represented in the city councils. The way you look at some of these early city councils, and the numbers vary, it can be 12, it can be 25, people actually represent the city councils. But you start out with large numbers of churchmen, like the abbot. Remember the guy who's running the monastery? His influence is there. So you have churchmen being a faction, nobles being a faction. But then you actually start getting a few of the guildmasters represented in there. The commune is actually one of these organizations where the government is controlled by the guilds. And the development sometimes can be slow, sometimes it can be rapid, sometimes there's fisticuffs involved. But as the guilds get more and more power, they get more and more wealth, they're able to buy privileges from the nobles. They're able to push the church's political power to the side. And to me, this is very exciting. Well, there is a factor involved here in which you really have to have defense. And remember, what is the function of the upper classes? The knights. They are providing protection for society. What you really have to have, if you want to have a free society, is you're going to have the ability for the society to protect itself. Therefore, you're going to have to take some of the military capability away from the nobles and place it in the hands of the peasants. If you don't do that, then the knights just simply push you around. Here's another statement we get from the Middle Ages. A man's home is his castle. Okay. What does that mean? That means that if you're in your home, you are, shall we say, sovereign in that place. But using the term castle, does not that imply your ability to defend your home, to defend your rights? Yes, it certainly does. If you're living in a city, there's just physical areas right here that you build walls. As surprising as to us, and I'm not denying that it's a very violent age. Middle Ages is a very violent age. We have wars going on, and I already mentioned one of the more devastating wars in the entire Middle Ages, the 100 Years' War. But in some places, cities exist for a lengthy period of time without walls. No need. But by the time you get to the end of the Middle Ages, end of the High Middle Ages, the violence level has gone up, and you do see city walls. Well, you're in the city, the commune. Well, who protects the walls? You've got to have somebody on the walls. You do simply this. Usually in the community, the bakers live on one street. The blacksmiths live on one street. The carpenters live on one street. If you're shopping, it's like a supermarket, isn't it? You go to various areas, and if you're buying canned goods, you go where the canned goods are. And if you're buying vegetables, you go to vegetables someplace else. So anybody coming in trying to buy something or use your services are going to come in and go into the place where these things are produced, and they tend to be a number of shops. And the areas that are closest to the walls to those shops, so these men can get there rapidly. You go over and you are given an assignment, a section of the walls. If you're bakers, the section of the walls right here, you get up, you're responsible for controlling that section of the walls. Carpenters, fishmongers, everybody else gets their section of the walls as well. The most important place in the walls is actually the city gates. Are they not the most vulnerable? If it's a lot easier to pound through a city gate, or to get the gate when it's open, or to get it and open it, than it is to storm up the walls where the carpenters are defending it. So who do you want to have as the persons to defend the city gates? Who's the buffest guy in town? The blacksmiths. Remember, I mentioned this earlier when we were talking about Lansdowne Meadows? You spend an awful lot of time taking your ore, you heat it up, and then you heat it up to a certain level, and you take these hammers and you pound them on to the point where you actually knock out the slag. You can imagine how buff these guys would be with these hammers over and over again. You put a weapon in that guy's hand, and he can do you damage. So the blacksmiths are going to be at the city gates. Also, there are times when the civic militias do go outside. The most important, shall we say, place in this defensive arrangement usually have these people in either squares or rectangles like that. And the most important place, of course, being the center. You want the center to hold. And of course, the city banners are right there. This is the city, Basel, whatever the city might be. And this is where we stand. Of course, where do you want the most buff guys? The guilds will actually be within themselves, be within their area, and they have a place to be. They have to stand in a certain place. And they have the guild banner, so you know where you're at. The people next to the city banner in the middle are once again the blacksmiths, these mega buff dudes. Okay, right to bear arms. They have places where you can go down and grab your weapons. Sometimes you have weapons at home. If you need to get out and get out there very, very rapidly, having the ability to simply go out and grab a weapon, and have a weapon at home, you can get out a lot faster than going down and grabbing weapons elsewhere. So the civic militias within the city itself becomes a defensive arrangement. That's helpful in the cities, but if you're trying to free societies outside of city walls, you probably have to have a little bit more than that. We have the development of infantries. Civic militias can go outside the walls and fight, but infantry actually denotes a larger numbers of men who are probably better trained and better outfitted in order to fight in the field. Now you could say, can you not, that once you're in the field, this is the domain of the knight. You've got to figure out a way to at least, if not dominate, to at least threaten the domination of the cavalry. So, development of infantries. I did ask you to read one of my articles. I've done a couple, 3 articles dealing with the Swiss and their wars. I asked you to look at the Battle of Merton. Hopefully you all handed that in. Hopefully you all got A's. Nonetheless, I hope you caught up on something, which I do mention in a couple of paragraphs, and that is one of the differences between the Swiss fighting the Burgundians was the fact that the Swiss came from a free society, and therefore you have these people that are much better capable of defending themselves because they have the use of arms. That's my point right here. You have free men. Let me give you some of the examples of the early infantries. One are the Scots. The Have you all seen the movie Braveheart? If you haven't seen it, I would recommend, and it's a guy flick. Uh, can we say with the guy flicks where machismo is very strong there? Well, unfortunately, every time I go to see a movie, I can't leave the historian at the door. He comes in with me and he's sitting right here. And I look at some of this, I'm going, holy mackerel. Talk about a bunch of Hollywood hokum. In the Battle of Stirling, for example, which should have been Stirling Bridge, we have the Scots wearing blue on their faces. The Scots didn't do this. The Scots, in fact, we do read about the early Britons, what, 1,000 years before this time frame? More than that, painting their faces blue. This is way, way out of kilter. Something else you have is, can we see this right here? They're wearing kilts. Now remember, this is late 13th century. This is like 1298. The Scots are not wearing kilts. That comes actually quite a bit later. In fact, the Scots are wearing trousers. So, okay. Hollywood hokum. They have a good example here. Another example is that they're depicting the Battle of Stirling Bridge. Well, and the motion picture says Stirling. Okay, the Battle of Stirling Bridge, there is a bridge involved. The English come across, the Scots attack them. Well, I guess it's harder to film or harder to find a bridge in order to do your filming. So they just did away with the bridge, did away with the water. It's like you're fighting the English out on an open plain. All right, so I'm being picky. All right, do I really think that this movie's not worth seeing from a historical standpoint? No, I think it is worth some insights because some of these things actually shock me in their accuracy. Do you remember before the Battle of Stirling, which we should have called Stirling Bridge, they have William Wallace ride up. And William Wallace rides up and they say, some of the men are talking, is that William Wallace? Well, it can't be. He's 7 feet tall. Now, William Wallace wasn't 7 feet tall. He's probably about 6'7". Enormous man for his generation. Very, very big. Well, remember, there's this clash between some of the nobles there on the battlefield. And we actually have the nobles are saying that, you give homage to us. And of course, Braveheart says, William Wallace says, I give homage to Scotland. Very good, very good. But now he's trying to inspire the people. And he gives a speech to the people, to these men, to inspire them. I am William Wallace. And I see a whole army of my countrymen here. You have come as free men, and free men you are. What will you do with that freedom? Will you fight? And some of the people say, oh, the English are too many. We will run and we will live. Wallace comes back and says, aye, run and you will live, at least for a while. But dying in your bed many years from now, would you be willing to change all the days from this to that for one chance, just one chance, to come back here and show our enemies that they may take our lives, but they'll never take our freedoms? Okay. This was commonly done before battles. You got men out there, sometimes they're well trained, sometimes not well trained. And you might die. You're going to face knights. And those knights can be really bad dudes. And what's at stake? In reading the sources, remember I've done a lot of work on the medieval Swiss and medieval other infantries as well. It was very common for people to stand up and remind them what's at stake. These speeches would include issues of honor. You'd be disgraced. How could you possibly live with the insult of not doing well today? But there's other things at stake. Your security, your families, your crops. And one thing they very commonly mention, your freedom. You will lose your privileges. You will lose some of these very coveted things if you do not perform well in the field of battle. So in looking at that, I'm going, whoa, where did that come from? Very authentic. It's a good speech. Sometimes the other speeches are, shall we say, more detailed. Well, Wallace rides across to the English. They said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm going to pick a fight." And the English leader is a very good historian. He says, "You have no heavy horse." In other words, you don't have any knights. In the last 300 years, there's never been a victory without cavalry. That's true. But Wallace had figured out a way to beat them. It's so dramatic in the motion picture. I can't possibly even come close to that. You have these men riding in horseback. They're gaining speed. They're closing in. The peasants are sitting there. And then they pull up what you and I would call pikes. In the motion picture, they're just sticks. Now these guys yelling, "Ah!" And as the horses come riding up, remember I talk about this in the article on Merton. The horses come riding up. And if you have a pike, and the Swiss pikes were like 18 feet long, as you recall, you come riding up, it's very difficult for you to fight through that or to challenge through that because that thing can knock you off on your fanning. Very often you would put the rear end of the pike into the ground. So the impact of somebody running into that, the knights in this case, would actually take the energy into the ground. And if the pike doesn't break, can we say that Wallace reinvents infantry tactics? We call it the Schildtau, and it was a square formation where you take men out, you take them out, and you march them around. They have pikes. And if they're charged by the enemy, you can lay these down. Sounds a little bit like the phalanx, the Greek phalanx we were talking about in your lecture. So this is ability to fight. Oh, something else. Maybe I shouldn't mention this, but I will. Those of you who've seen the motion picture, remember that there is let's put it this way, as obscene gestures, trying to taunt the English. And in doing so, remember these men have kilts. In the Middle Ages, they weren't using kilts. But they pull their kilts up to show their behinds and their manhood. And once again, falling off my chair. Because in the Middle Ages, this kind of thing was done when you taunted your enemies. Sometimes the sources were written by monks, by churchmen who saying, well, maybe I ought to put this in the account, but let's clean it up a little bit. Sometimes they would say the people were using unchristian gestures. In other words, obscene gestures. They're flipping them off. They insulted their manhood. I've never run across accounts of them pulling their pants down, but I have ran across accounts where they say that the enemy are more interested in making love to animals than making love to women. You know, these are pretty strong insults. Once again, this is an issue of authenticity. Well, okay. Free men, the Scots. One of the problems with the Scots have is the English. The Scots are largely a free peasant society. Yes, they do win at the Battle of Stirling Bridge, but they're up against the English, and the English have the longbow. Bow's been around for millennia. You can imagine how superior that would be if you're hunting animals back even in the Neolithic. If you, rather than snares or throwing something at an animal, the fact that you have a bow. And the bows could be very, very powerful by the time you get to the English. For a long time, the longbow, let me get your longbow up here. And give you an idea of what these things look like. Longbow, of course, we have this representation of an English longbowman. And the longbow would give more tensile strength to the weapon. A question we have to ask ourselves is, how powerful were these bows? Well, when I was first reading about this back, when I was in college 50 years ago or whatever, the historians were speculating that the longbow had a power of about a draw strength about 70 pounds. You know what draw strength is. And the English used 2 fingers. I know nowadays we take archery classes and they say you use 3 fingers to hold this. 3 fingers probably have a certain advantage, but the English use 2. How do we know the English use 2? Well, we see representations in art. We see representation in illuminated manuscripts. But there's an insult. I don't know if I should do it or not because I'm sure I'm going to offend somebody. But using 2 fingers like this is in many countries even today an insult. It's like flipping them off, right? Can we say it's defiance? Can be somewhat obscene. Now, during the Second World War, as you know, we find V for victory, and you flash the V sign. The V's like this. You turn it around, it's obscene. Why do you see this as an insult starting in the Middle Ages? Because these are the 2 fingers you use to draw the bow. So in showing you the 2 fingers, saying, I have the ability to defend you and defy you. Pretty ugly during the 100 Years' War. There were some times when the French would capture the English and they would mutilate them before they released them. And that would be to cut off these 2 fingers. In doing so, then you would be unable to use the bow. But let's go back. When I was reading about this initially, they were speculating the draw strength on these things were about 70 pounds. That's a pretty considerable bow. When we used to mess around with bows when I was a kid, I had a hard time pulling things with like even 50-pound draw strength. Anything more than that was somewhat challenging. Well, one of the problems with our understanding how strong they were is we really didn't have any examples. They didn't show up in the armories. We found all kinds of weapons. We find pikes. we find armor. We find muskets, all kinds of things in armories. But for whatever reason, we don't see these things in the armories. Well, I believe it was the Mary Rose. It was a ship that sunk off the coast of England around 1500. And of course, it was examined. And some of the things that were brought up from it, and including longbows. I hadn't seen these before. Well, these things have been in the water for centuries. Now, obviously, you're not going to string that thing and be able to use it. But you can get a pretty good idea of how they were constructed. The use of resins, the use of different kinds of woods for flexibility. Immediately, therefore, the estimates as to the draw strengths of these things went up dramatically. In fact, the estimates now are up to 140-pound draw strength, 150-pound draw strength. If I've never seen anything that strong. If I were to grab one of these things, I couldn't budge it, let alone use it effectively. And this is very important to remember. To be able to use a weapon that powerful effectively, you really had to start out as a child. Of course, you had smaller bows for little kids. As the boys grow bigger, you get bigger, more powerful bows. To be able to use these effectively, you're going to have to be one buff dude. Okay. Now, all the gentlemen and ladies in this class as well could probably do that because you're all in great shape. I could not. But you can imagine if you're using this thing, fire over and over and over again. Pull your arrow out. Usually you have it in the ground. You pull it out and you fire like this. And to do that in rapidity in a battle situation leaves an awful lot of power. And to hit anything at long distances, 100, 200 yards, even longer than that, takes a tremendous amount of skill. In other words, you have to have a free society. We call these English yeomen. Free men who have been practicing weapons literally since childhood. Remember, the right to bear arms is a symbol of a free society. As awful as it was, there was a brief period of time when the English kings were afraid that maybe there's not enough practice going on. What they were concerned about is a very, very early version of soccer. Soccer back then was nothing like the rules we have today. Since you had a village here, a village here, and you had a ball. You usually made out of sheep's bladder. You put some rags in it or something, and you kick the ball. And if you win, if you kick the ball, I guess through the fields, down the lane, and through the center of the other part of town, your opponent's village. Well, how cruel is that, asking an Englishman not to play soccer? This didn't last very long. And the English do have this superb weapon. It's so powerful that it can actually go through very heavy objects. We read accounts of the bows that went through doors that were 4 fingers thick. I don't know if that's 4 fingers like this or 4 fingers like that. I don't know, but it's at least that thick. Would go through a door of solid wood. There's another account of a knight who was unfortunately hit by one of these things. The shaft went through his armor, his mail shirt. It went through his mail breeches down here. It went through his entire body. As it came out on the other side, it also went through his chain mail coming out, went into his wood saddle, pinning him there. And what am I talking about? Let's go chain mail. What was commonly done for armor early on, and of course you can imagine how very expensive this would be, that you would actually use the iron, you would take this small rings and you'd interwove them, and you can see some of these are almost like so small it's almost like weaving cloth. This could be very, very helpful if somebody's swinging a sword at you or is trying to stick you with a spear. However, when you do get the longbow can drill right through this. So then you get a developed late Middle Ages, which we call plate armor. This is probably about 16th century, a little bit later than the time frame we're discussing. But often when we think about armor in the Middle Ages, we are talking about plate armor. Notice that in many cases, you have a small ridge. The armor is not terribly thick. It can't be too thick or it's too heavy. It's pretty heavy as it is. A good set of plate armor might weigh 40 to 60 pounds. In order to withstand a blow, having this angled out is somewhat helpful. However, if you have a longbow and it hits a flat surface, do I have an example of this? You hit a flat surface right here, it can go through it. If you have something like that that is angled somewhat and it doesn't hit directly in, it can glance off. Some historians have said that, well, maybe there's a possibility that this was not terribly effective. Well, as we read the sources, yeah, the longbow can still do damage to this. If it's a direct shot, it can go through the armor. Now, let's go back and see what's happening to the Scots. Later on, when William Wallace is still fighting against the English at Hyden Hill and places like this, the children, they come out in these large squares, they come out and attack, and then you get the English, and they go, and they simply mow them down. The tragedy of medieval warfare, as far as the Scots were concerned, therefore included the fact they came up against the English. So we don't really look upon the Scots so much as setting up a military tradition, which is followed by other peoples. But that's not true of the Swiss. Going back to the Battle of Merton, the Swiss had been fighting in squares. They've been fighting in squares for a few generations by this time frame. And the various people who fight on foot were using not rigid formations. In other words, the English longbowmen, for example, would go out on the field and go point, and without having strict discipline and a strict formation. But the Swiss do have a strict formation. Remember I told you in the article about the Haufen, the magnificent square? And you have the pikemen on the outside. On the inside, you have the halberdiers, these guys with a variation of the battle axe. And this becomes the model that almost all infantries in Europe start following after the Battle of Merton. So the Swiss become very important in this change. Okay, now we have the ability for peasants to go out in the field and face off the enemy cavalry. That becomes a big deal. One thing I should mention as far as the English are concerned, one of the reasons why a small nation like England against a large nation like France fights the 100 Years' War is that the English longbow is such an effective weapon in mowing down the French knights that it takes France a long time to get enough resources to beat them. By 1200 AD, communes, we talked about that just a few minutes ago, rule most everywhere in Central and Western Europe within the communities. The communities are not just there for defense. They are economic enclaves. That's really why you have a city. Remember, the guilds are there to make money. But the communes also show vigor. It is in these communes, and sometimes these cities are not very big. They build the great Gothic cathedrals. I love medieval art. I'm going to talk about medieval art. I'm going to probably beat you up about medieval art in a lecture soon. But let's point out this, that we look even today at some of these places where these magnificent structures were located. Sometimes it took over 100 years to build these things. The expertise involved, the expense involved would be absolutely huge. And they're still in small communities. Well, maybe you have people donating money. We'll come back and talk about this later. But can we say, if you're building these magnificent churches, then sometimes absolutely enormous, even by our standards, they're huge, that this shows the vigor, the strength, the organization of the communes. Well, let's take this discussion a little bit farther. And let's take a look now at representative governments. There's one thing about in a small area, there are village communities which are also democratic, not just the cities. But in reality, a lot of times, you do see other representative governments. And shall we say, on a larger scale. This can be a region, this could be a principality, it can be a nation, it can be a kingdom. Well, where does representative governments come from? One of the earliest examples, perhaps the earliest example, is in Iceland. Iceland, my goodness, Iceland. Okay. There are regional assemblies, people in the various areas, and they call these the Thing. And the Thing actually translates roughly as assembly. And who are the people? Well, the local Vikings. They get together and they talk it out. You get representatives from the regional things to go to the central government, which is called the Althing, the All Assembly. 930, clearly within the Viking Age. Can we say, maybe I'm overstating this, but let's throw this out for your interest. This could be the oldest functioning representative government in the world. The Althing still exists. As we look at the history of this in Iceland, there are time frames when this doesn't come together. And sometimes that can be years or even a few decades. But can we say, even though it doesn't meet as frequently as perhaps we would like it to meet, in reality it's an institution that never entirely winks out. Now, fortunately, or unfortunately, if you will, Iceland is not a shaker and mover as far as organizations and governments are concerned. You know, people aren't running around in Paris and London, walking around saying, well, let's make a better form of government. Let's go to Iceland and look at this as an example. The people in Europe probably knew nothing about this at all. So, and like I say, the Althing still exists in Iceland even today. Let's go back to a closer examination of the councils. Why do these things actually exist when you already have an established prince, or king, or other kinds of monarchs? Well, the councils are called by the kings for advice on how to get money. What does a king want? He wants money, money for the palace, money for his clothing, money for his food, money for the armies. He wants to be able to defend the realm. He wants to be able to expand his power. He wants to keep the English at bay, get rid of these doggone people. You need money to do that. He has a lot of personal power. He can stand up and say, well, by the way, I'm raising taxes. That might not go over in a lot of places because they can threaten his power. What the king needs is advice. You get important people. You get the greater nobility. Let's get together. Let's have this council. And you can advise the king on how to get money. Later on, you want money men involved as well, not just the nobles. Nobles are wealthy very often. If they're not getting gouged by inflation, they own a lot of land. But other people, money men, merchants, traders, people that are involved in long distance trade. And these people have money because they are very successful. So you call in the greater nobles for their advice, and you also call in the merchants for their advice. Well, how do you get money? Well, if you get support from the realm, taxation usually. But there's something that's very important here. The issue is this, that sometimes these people say, oh yes, let's figure out how to get you more money, but we want something in return. It's a little bit like the peasants negotiating with the nobles. Wait a minute, there's fewer of us. You need more money? Well, let's give us something that we want. And it's very similar to this in this instance, because now the nobles, now the rich people, the money people, the nobles are turning to the king, say, oh, by the way, we want something in return. And sometimes that in return happens to be greater authority, greater representation, greater power. The king needs the money badly enough, he'll say, sure, we can do that. Right. So one of the earliest national, at least on a large scale, representative governments is in Spain. It's the Cortes. The Cortes are roughly translated as courts. We can also call this a legislature. We, in a similar manner to Iceland, we don't usually think of Spain as a leader in representative governments. But in fact, it is. And the first real legislature that comes together, remember these are nobles and the money men, comes together in 1188. Whoa. How long is the Cortes functioning? We read about this in Renaissance Spain. We read about this in medieval Spain. We read about this in early modern Spain. It's about 1823, and rather than pinning down to 1 year, I said early 19th century. Unfortunately, it does weak out. Now, in modern Spain, we know that we have legislatures again. But this lengthy period of time ultimately is not successful in maintaining its position. But can we say, oh my goodness, I'm running out of time. Can we say that the time frame in which we are discussing, that you need a theoretical, or shall we say religious basis for your understanding of representative governments and people's rights? And in this case, it's going to be the church ideas. Unfortunately, we will have to wait until next time for that discussion. In the meantime, I'm hoping whatever you're doing, you're having a great time. I'm hoping when you're looking at this, the weather is wonderful. And I hope you're chilling out and enjoying life to the full. In the meantime, talk to you later.